to inherit from different objects, right? We have a base class here called a car, and from that we inherit all the properties from car in a model. We could have multiple inheritance. We could have a type of vehicle which inherits from an airplane class and a train class and a bus class. That's a polymorphic object, right? It has a vehicle which inherits tons of things. Okay, so let's look at asynchronous JavaScript. What is asynchronous JavaScript? Synchronous programming is what we've been doing so far. JavaScript reads and executes the application from top to bottom, left to right. Asynchronous programming is the opposite of this. It is a cornerstone of how Node.js works, so it'll be important moving forward. Next to understanding this, async is probably the second most difficult thing about JavaScript. We've already seen callbacks a little bit, but we'll take a deeper dive here. Right, callback hell is when you have too many callbacks being chained together. To simplify callback hell, ES6 introduced promises. Promises are kind of like functions that are asynchronous. A promise constructor takes in two parameters. The first is a resolve and the second is reject. When you call resolve, that activates the .then, and reject calls the .catch side. We can chain these promises and returning promises from other functions. We can also call promise.all. Async await is a newer way of consuming promises. It replaces .then and .catch. Okay, so you'll be consuming promises with .then, .catch, and or async await syntax. Let's take a quick look at promises real quick. So, the promise object represents the eventual completion or failure of an asynchronous operation and its resulting value. To learn about the way promises work or how you can use them, you can read the using promises first. A promise is a proxy for a value not necessarily known. When the promise is created, it allows you to associate handlers with asynchronous actions, eventual success or failure reason. This lets asynchronous methods return values like synchronous methods instead of immediately returning the final value. The asynchronous method returns a promise to supply the value at some point. A promise is in one of these states: pending, which is the initial state; fulfilled, meaning the operation was completed; rejected, meaning the operation failed. A pending promise can either be fulfilled with a value or rejected with a reason. So here's an interaction that we can look at. So here's the promise. We go to fulfill, we go to reject. This gives us our asynchronous actions. This gives us our .then, as we said. And then we have the return of the promise, which goes to .then and .catch. So why do I care? Asynchronous programming is a technique that enables your program to start potentially long-running tasks, and then rather than having to wait until that task is finished, to be able to continue to be responsive to other events, that task can keep running. Once the task is completed, your program is presented with the result. This means no waiting. So people want this sort of asynchronous behavior. That way they don't have to wait for the page to load. So what do I need? VS Code, Mozilla Developer documentation. So how do I do it? Here we have an example. We want to take this, we want to add an additional parameter to this example. My calculator takes in two function arguments here, num1, num2, and then a callback. And here we're adding these numbers together to get a sum, and then we call our callback, which takes the sum. Now this is just a callback, right? So when we call my calculator takes these two parameters here and this third one, which is the callback. And you can see that we're passing in the function myDisplayer. Run this example and modify it so that we can take the additional sum of another number. So not just two parameters, we want to have three. So here's the solution. We just add an additional parameter here, and if we call that method, it should print out the three terms as we saw in the example before. This time it's going to take the sum of all three of these terms rather than just two numbers. What about? When should I use asynchronous JavaScript? Asynchronous loops are necessary when there is a large number of iterations involved or when the operations within the loop are complex. But for simple tasks like iterating through a small array, there's no reason to overcomplicate things by using complex recursive functions.